Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics, your bite-sized guide to the corridors of power. I'm Caroline Hepker. And today we're going to do something a little bit different. This general election, there is only one female leader on the ballot. Do you know which one? It's the co-leader of the Green Party, of course. And yet, increasingly, women hold many of the key jobs in Westminster, from the business secretary to the deputy leader to the Shadow Chancellor. So we're going to spend one day a week in this election season looking at some of the women who will shape Britain as a result of this general election. Now, if, and it is an if, Labour were to win, Britain's economic challenges would remain stark on so many fronts. The woman, and she would be the first woman who would have to try to find the answers to some of those questions, would be Rachel Reeves. But how much do we actually know about her? Our associate editor, Ailbhe, has covered Rachel Reeves for many years, has interviewed her on lots of occasions, so she's with me in this studio to discuss. Ailbhe, we see endless scripted speeches and broadcast interviews, and TikToks, of course. What is Rachel Reeves actually like?
I mean, the scripted stuff and the tough economic message and being tough on the public finances, never playing fast and loose with it, that's a big part of who she is publicly and a massive part of Labour's offer at this general election. But behind the scenes, she is less serious. She has a famously dirty laugh. She's sort of a bit more relaxed. But she's also a bit of an operator. I think, speaking to her and her team, there's this running theme that she, wants to use her time well. So we'll come on to that probably a bit later. But even at times when she hasn't been at the top of politics, she's been writing books.
Lots of books.
She's been writing a lot of books, chairing select committees, conducting research, writing papers. And there's one nugget, Caroline, that I think says a lot about her, that she sends hundreds of Christmas cards. I think it's nearly 1,000.
Christmas cards?
Yeah, nearly 1,000 Christmas cards. And she starts writing them in the summer because there's so many. And she's been doing it for years. I said this to my friend Katie Bowles, who is, of course, political editor at The Spectator, right before she interviewed Rachel Reeves. And I said, see if you can get her to confirm that. And she did. So that's a matter of public record that Rachel Reeves writes about 1,000 Christmas cards and starts writing them in the summer.
So that's interesting you say an operator, that personal touch and connection. I mean, that's pretty fascinating as a little window into who she is. I mean, if there is something else that our audience does actually know about her, at least her kind of public image, it's that she used to work for the Bank of England. What did she actually do kind of before going into politics?
Yes, and the Bank of England thing is interesting because Matt Hancock, who many people remember, used to be the health secretary, then went on I'm a Celeb.
Eventually, after a few jobs in between.
A few jobs and a few scandals in between. He also used to work for the Bank of England for roughly the same amount of time as Rachel Reeves. And there are other people in politics who have started their careers at the Bank of England. But she's the only one who's really co-opted it as part of her public image. And so if you don't know very much about her, I think probably what you would know, as you say, is I used to be an economist at the Bank of England. I will never play fast and loose with the public finances. It's a big part of her message and trying to sort of emphasise her economic credibility. But she wasn't there for very long. I mean, if we want to go right back, she was born in Lewisham, in Thatcher's Britain. She went to a state school. She talks about that kind of forming her politic. Her classroom being a couple of prefab huts and the school being quite run down, and she kind of attributes that to Thatcher's management of Britain. She joined the Labour Party at 16. It's a real Labour family. Her sister is a Labour MP. Her brother-in-law is a Labour MP. She got good grades from her state school. She was a child chess champion. She went on to go to Oxford. She did PPE. She was involved in student politics there, where she rubbed shoulders with Matt Hancock, actually, and just by coincidence, because since we mentioned him, and lots of other people who are still knocking around politics. And then she went to the Bank of England, worked at HBOS for a while.
The bank, yeah.
And before the economic crash. But really, she knew that she always wanted to go into politics. She stood for selection quite early on.
Speaking of chess, There was a little challenge. You better introduce this clip.
Yes, so as you say, I've interviewed Rachel Reeves a few times, and in my previous job before this one, I used to make a podcast, and I don't know why I did it, challenged Rachel Reeves to a game of chess, in which she absolutely hammered me.
Do you want to be white?
Yeah,
There's a slight advantage. Check. 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 Checkmate. Very good. It took me longer than I should have done. Right.
Do you feel self-conscious in moments like that ever?
When I play chess, I block everything else out. So I only look at the board. I don't look at the person I'm playing. I certainly don't look around me, because then you lose your concentration. And, you know, for however long the game lasts, I just focus entirely on that.
I heard, though, that took me longer than it should have when you finished. That you...
So, not above humiliating yourself for your job. Mind you, I do say you played for quite a long time, but I think the clip made it sound pretty quick.
Cruelly edited with my consent. But actually, she still plays chess.
Yes.
And she still takes the time to sort of go to local chess clubs and support especially girls playing chess, because she would say that her experience of doing chess tournaments as a young girl with lots of kids from private school kind of gave her a bit of sort of steel in her armour, because she was the only state school girl there, and she was kind of determined to do better than the mostly boys there, and you can still see that competitive side in her.
Yeah, I think that's really an interesting little window, isn't it, into her personality. I mean, when she became Shadow Chancellor, I think that is a kind of really important thing to think about. Rishi Sunak was sort of thrust into that role, and then it was for a very brief time, of course, before he became Prime Minister. This isn't Rachel Reeves' first time, though, actually, at the top of Westminster.
She was put into Ed Miliband's shadow cabinet within a year of being elected an MP, and she was relatively young. She was made his shadow work and pension secretary,
Yes.
so it was a very quick rise the first time. But going into the 2015 election, she was actually quite central in Ed Miliband's shadow cabinet. They thought that they were going to win the election, so did the Tories. Everyone forgets this, but it was quite a shock to them that they didn't actually win. On the night, everyone thought it would be them going into government. In Ed Miliband's shadow cabinet, she took on the shadow work and pensions brief, which meant that, I mean, the party strategy at the time was to take quite a tough line on benefits, because that was an area where they felt they lacked credibility. Mm-hmm. It meant that she was personally responsible for being the person to say, we will be tougher than the Tories on benefits. It's the party of working people, the clue's in the name. Lots of things that might not sound that controversial to some of our listeners, but to people within the Labour Party was a bit offensive. And so there are lots of people on the left of the Labour Party who took a dislike to Rachel Reeves at that time, and those lines followed her until really quite recently. She's done a lot more now, which has pushed this out of people's memories, but she became a bit of a hate figure for some people in the Labour Party. People talking about her as a red Tory. I think that was quite difficult for her, being disliked by lots of people in her own party.
Yes.
Especially when they didn't even win. And after that, of course, Labour didn't win the election. She went to the backbenches and had a bit of time to reflect. And she talks about how maybe she would have done some of that differently.
Yeah. And I was reading over her 2018 pamphlet, for example, where she sort of lays out, in that sort of time on the backbenches, actually some of her economic view. It's called Everyday Economics, that pamphlet. And also then, I suppose it's quite a long time ago, 2015, there was all the Corbyn years in between that. So perhaps, some time and water under the bridge. And so that really brings me to, I think, the most Bloomberg question that I want you to try to answer for me, which is that there are still so many unanswered questions about Labour's economic vision, and trying to get to the heart of what we actually think Rachel Reeves's instincts are and what sort of a chancellor, were Labour to win, she might actually make.
It's interesting because ultimately we just don't know what any of these people will be like in government because we haven't seen it yet. But in her time as Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves has been crystal clear, publicly and privately, that Labour doesn't win unless it is beating the Tories on economic credibility. Literally, in terms of the polling, they have never been able to win an election unless they're ahead of the Tories on that crucial metric. And so that has been first and foremost. And so the key thing for her as Shadow Chancellor, the keeper of the purse strings, is that they will have no unfunded spending commitments. And she has run the party finances with quite a tight grip, to the frustration of quite a few of her shadow cabinet colleagues. I think we can expect to see that in government, that she will run the Treasury like that. But she's still, for all that she's on the right of the Labour Party, she's still pretty left-wing. She still has these deep beliefs about wanting to invest in state education, improving that, you know, going right back to her time as a schoolgirl. Education under Tony Blair. That's sort of what motivated her to get to stand as a candidate back under Tony Blair. She still has these convictions, and it would be interesting to see how much that changes in government.
Yeah, and an economy focused on workers. A final thought, if you would, Rachel Reeves. I mean, she's a female economist in a field that has been, you know, struggled with diversity. She's a mother of two. You mentioned she's got a sister also deeply involved in the Labour Party. She's also very interested herself in the women of the Labour Party. So a thought on her as the first Chancellor in literally hundreds and hundreds of years of English history.
That will definitely mean a lot to her. She's written multiple books, but mostly about the role of women in politics. She wrote a history of the women in Westminster. She wrote the biography of the first female MP in her seat. She cares quite deeply and very sincerely about, I mean, in some ways, the quite obscure history of Labour's women, people that listeners won't have heard of, like Jenny Lee, Beatrice Webb, Alice Bacon, obscure figures. She cares a lot about that. And she herself talks about how much it would mean to her to be the first female Chancellor. That's a glass ceiling that has not yet been smashed, unlike Prime Minister. And I think she talks herself about the economics profession being quite male-dominated and wanting to make a difference in that regard.
So then, how do you think a potential Rachel Reeves as Chancellor would actually affect the UK? What impact would she have on Britain's future, if that's what we're talking about?
I think my own view is it's really worth thinking of the Labour leadership as a duo of Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. So there's no understating how important that she is. We've talked about how she's steeped in Labour history. She's steeped in economics. She really knows how she wants to run an economy and run a country. Keir Starmer, for all of his strengths, is not a career politician, doesn't have that history in the Labour Party. He's much less ideological, and he takes a lot of his cues from Rachel Reeves. And I've certainly noticed over the past few years, some of the things that she has said to me in interviews have become the view of Keir Starmer. You can hear it in, you know, even in recent Q&As with journalists. He says things, and I think that's exactly Rachel Reeves' view. And so I think he's very deeply influenced by her. She really is someone who has his ear. So when you're thinking about how the country will be governed, it's worth not just understanding Keir Starmer, but her as well. Definitely the just economic credibility, stability, honouring the OBR and the economic institutions. That's
and
a big
phrase of securonomics that she's talked about a lot and has talked to Bloomberg a lot about.
Yeah, exactly. So there's the sort of promising stability in terms of reassurance to the country after especially Liz Truss's mini budget. But then there's also this economic vision that's a bit like, you could unfairly maybe describe it as Bidenomics without the money, in that they want to see a package of, it's a mixture of green stimulus and investment in jobs in the UK to get the economy moving, but also with a view on realigning the economy so that more things are homegrown to protect the British economy in an increasingly unstable global landscape with the rise of great powers like China and Russia. So energy security is a really big part of that. But just in general, being self-sufficient essentially. So it's not quite protectionism, but it's flirting with that idea. The reason I call it Bidenomics without the money is that Rachel Reeves has acknowledged that the economic inheritance, should they win, will be the worst since the Second World War. So Labour hasn't they had pledged quite a big amount of investment. They've come off that pledge. So now they are really dependent on the private sector making up the difference. So a lot of the economic strategy that we're going to see from her and the rest of the Labour team is just trying to attract that private sector investment. It will depend much more on that than what the government itself is spending.
Ailbhe, thank you so much for being with me, for talking over, well, one of the potential women who could shape the future of Britain as we head towards the general election on the 4th of July. We'll be talking about a lot more women in power who could influence Britain. If you like the programme, of course, don't forget you can subscribe. You can give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen. This episode was produced by James Wilcock. Our audio engineer was Sean Guastamakia. I'm Caroline Hepker and we'll be back with more tomorrow.